Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back, to a world where the insistent shriek of an alarm clock was just a fever dream waiting to happen. Imagine waking up, not to that jarring digital assault on your eardrums, but to, well, we'll get to that. Let's just say, if you're used to hitting snooze 5 times, you probably wouldn't survive a Victorian-era morning. Trust me, you are jolted awake, not by noise, but by something else. It's subtle, natural. The world unfolds at its own pace. It's a concept so foreign to our frantically scheduled lives that it's practically an alien invasion of serenity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing where in the world you all are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a small, dimly lit room. It's not your room, not really. It smells faintly of wood smoke and something earthy, like turnips. Definitely turnips. Or maybe slightly rotted potatoes. It's rustic. Through the small, leaded glass window, you notice the sky is just beginning to lighten. A pre-dawn gray is slowly pushing back the inky blackness. No streetlights hum here, no car horns blare. Just quiet. This, my friend, is your Victorian-era bedroom. Congratulations. The first thing that strikes you is the absence of that familiar, rectangular tyrant sitting on your nightstand. No glowing numbers, no charging cable snaking across the floor, no alarm clock. Instead, you notice a small, intricately carved wooden box sitting on a nearby table. It's odd. You'll have to investigate that later. But back to the lack of alarms. How did people wake up? Well, the answer is multifaceted and surprisingly natural. For the vast majority of the population, the sun was their alarm clock. Makes sense, right? You wake up when the sun comes up. Simple, elegant, brutal if you're a night owl. Of course, not everyone lived in a picturesque cottage bathed in sunlight. And not everyone had the luxury of waking up whenever they pleased. So, what about the working class, the factory workers, the people who needed to be at their jobs at a specific, pre-sunrise time? That's where things get a little creative. One common method was the knocker-upper. Yes, that's a real job title. These were individuals, often elderly women or out-of-work men, who would be hired to rouse people from their slumber. Their tools of the trade? A long, lightweight stick, often made of bamboo, which they would use to tap on windows. Or, in some cases, a pea shooter filled with dried peas. Imagine someone pelting your window with peas at 5 a.m. Talk about a rude awakening. And you thought your iPhone alarm was bad. You can almost hear the gentle tapping on the glass, a rhythmic percussion that slowly permeates your consciousness. It's persistent, but not aggressive. More like a persistent, mildly annoying mosquito than a full-blown air raid siren. Interestingly, knocker-uppers were often paid a small fee per week by their clients, and they wouldn't leave until they were absolutely certain that the person was awake. Some even used rattles or horns to make extra sure. You can picture them, trudging through the pre-dawn streets, armed with their arsenal of noise-making devices, the unsung heroes of the Victorian workday. Now, here's a slightly more unorthodox method. You see, some people, particularly those in rural areas, relied on animal instinct. Specifically, the instinct of chickens, or roosters, to be precise. Some resourceful individuals would keep their chickens in a coop near their bedroom window, relying on the rooster's natural crowing to wake them up. Free-range alarm clocks, if you will. Of course, this method wasn't exactly foolproof. Roosters aren't known for their punctuality. And sometimes, they just don't crow. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're just not feeling it. Whatever the reason, relying on a rooster to get you to work on time was a bit of a gamble. Still, points for ingenuity, right? Imagine explaining to your boss that you were late because your rooster overslept. And then, there are the more elaborate contraptions. You remember that intricately carved wooden box you saw earlier? Well, take a closer look. You notice a small hole in the top, and a faint ticking sound emanating from within. It's a water clock alarm. These ingenious devices used a slow drip of water to gradually fill a container. As the container filled, it would eventually trigger a mechanism, often a bell or a lever, which would then wake you up. Think of it as a very slow, very wet Rube Goldberg machine designed to assault your senses. The accuracy of these water clocks varied wildly, depending on the design and the quality of the materials used. Some were remarkably precise, while others were about as reliable as a weather forecast. But hey, at least they were interesting. And they certainly beat getting pelted with peas. Now, here's where things get a little debated. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of knocker-uppers was truly as common as popular imagination suggests. While they certainly existed, some argue that their prevalence has been somewhat exaggerated in popular culture. Were they a ubiquitous feature of every Victorian city, or a more localized phenomenon? The jury is still out. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. There are accounts of people using candles with strategically placed nails to wake themselves up. The candle would burn down, melt the wax, and the nail would fall, making a noise and hopefully jolting you awake. Ingenious, if slightly terrifying. Imagine waking up to the smell of burning wax and the sound of a nail clattering to the floor. Talk about starting your day with a jolt of adrenaline. You pull back the heavy woolen blankets and swing your feet onto the cold, stone floor. The air is crisp, almost biting. You shiver slightly, pulling a thin shawl around your shoulders. Time to face the day. No hitting snooze, no scrolling through social media. Just the quiet dawn, the faint smell of turnips, and the knowledge that a knocker-upper might be lurking outside your window, armed with a pea shooter and a mission. Good morning, Victorian England. You probably won't survive this either. Okay, all right, settle in a little deeper. Let's talk about sunlight and sleep. Two things that, frankly, modern life has kind of messed with, hasn't it? I mean, you're probably listening to this on a device emitting blue light, aren't you? Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. We all do it. But back in the Victorian era, things were different. Simpler maybe. Or maybe just less illuminated. You're waking up. No jarring electronic screech. No insistent radio DJ. Just light. Soft, diffused light filtering through your window. Think about that for a second. The quality of the light itself is dictating your day. It's a subtle cue, not a blaring command. Your body is responding to the gradual increase in brightness, a natural alarm clock powered by the sun itself. No snooze button here, friend. Unless you're really good at blocking out light with, like, a strategically placed blanket fort. Which, honestly, I fully support. Now, the Victorians, bless their cotton socks, weren't exactly basking in glorious sunshine all the time. Especially in places like London, which, let's be honest, was basically a perpetually foggy soup. So, their sleep cycles were, unsurprisingly, quite influenced by the seasons. During the summer, when the sun was up at, like, ridiculously early o'clock, they'd naturally wake up earlier too. Days were longer, work started earlier, and, presumably, afternoon tea was enjoyed in slightly more daylight. In the winter, though? Oh, winter in Victorian England. Imagine the gloom. The perpetual twilight. You'd be waking up later, feeling perpetually sluggish, and probably consuming alarming quantities of coal dust just from breathing. And that's where the first sleep and second sleep thing comes back into play. Remember that? Because daylight hours were shorter in the winter, the long period of darkness meant you were more likely to wake up in the middle of the night anyway. So, you might as well make the most of it. Read a book. Pray. Engage in some light, needlepoint. Whatever floats your boat in the dead of night. I imagine the Victorians had some rather interesting conversations in the middle of the night. Oh, pardon me, Lady Beatrice. Are you also experiencing existential dread at 3 a.m.? Indeed, Mildred. Care for a biscuit? One mainstream historical fact about Victorian life is that the Industrial Revolution played a massive role in shaping people's daily routines. Factories needed workers, and factories needed workers to be on time. So, even though natural light was still a factor, the demands of the industrial workforce started to enforce a more rigid schedule. Suddenly, waking up with the sun wasn't quite as optional. You had a steam-powered loom to operate, for goodness sake. But even with the rise of factories, most people still worked outdoors, or at least were more exposed to the elements than we are today. So, the sun still had a significant influence on their sleep patterns. You know, thinking about it, the Victorians were probably a lot more in tune with their circadian rhythms than we are. We're all bathed in artificial light all the time, completely divorced from the natural world. You can wake up at 3 p.m. and not even know it's technically night. The Victorians didn't have that luxury. Or maybe it was a luxury. Hard to say. Now, for a quirky tidbit. There's this persistent rumor and I stress, rumor, that some particularly superstitious Victorians believed that sleeping with your head pointing north would ensure good dreams. Apparently, aligning yourself with the Earth's magnetic field was supposed to somehow optimize your subconscious. I have absolutely no idea if there's any truth to this, but I like the image of entire households rotating their beds like compass needles, desperately seeking a peaceful night's sleep. Can you imagine trying to explain that to your modern-day partner? Darling, I've reoriented the bed. It's for optimal dream alignment. You'd probably end up sleeping on the sofa, facing whatever direction the cat happens to be looking. But even without magnetic alignment, the position of the sun did influence the layout of Victorian houses. Wealthier families would often build their bedrooms on the east side of the house, so they could be woken up by the morning sun. Talk about designing your life around natural light. It's the ultimate commitment to waking up naturally. I bet they were insufferable at brunch. Oh, I simply must have the Eggs Benedict. You see, I woke up with the dawn chorus, so I've been awake for hours. And speaking of wealthy families, they were also more likely to have access to things like thicker curtains and shutters, allowing them to control the amount of light entering their bedrooms. So, while the working classes were largely at the mercy of the sun's schedule, the upper classes had a bit more wiggle room. They could essentially buy themselves extra sleep by blocking out the light, which, let's be honest, is still a pretty effective strategy today. Except now you're buying blackout curtains from Amazon instead of commissioning them from a local artisan. Progress? Now, here's a fun scholarly debate for you. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Victorian obsession with cleanliness and hygiene affected their sleep. On the one hand, a clean and well-ventilated bedroom would undoubtedly have been more conducive to sleep than a cramped and dirty one. On the other hand, the Victorian obsession with cleanliness could also be quite anxiety-inducing. Imagine constantly worrying about germs and dust mites and the general filthiness of the world. That can't have been great for relaxation. There's also the question of bedding. Victorian mattresses were often stuffed with things like straw, feathers, or even horsehair, which, frankly, sounds incredibly uncomfortable and probably quite itchy. But again, access to better bedding was often a matter of class. The wealthy could afford luxurious feather mattresses and fine linen sheets, while the poor had to make do with whatever they could find. So, even something as simple as a comfortable mattress could have had a significant impact on sleep quality. I mean, try sleeping on a pile of horsehair for 8 hours. I dare you. So, you see, the Victorian relationship with sleep and sunlight was a complex one. It was shaped by the seasons, the demands of industry, social class, and even superstition. It was a world where natural light was a powerful force, dictating daily routines and influencing sleep patterns in ways that we can barely imagine today. And it's worth remembering that we evolved to live in tune with these cycles. Maybe, just maybe, we could learn a thing or two from our Victorian ancestors about the importance of listening to our bodies and embracing the natural rhythms of the world. Or, we could just keep hitting the snooze button and mainlining coffee. Your call. But for now, let's just imagine that soft, diffused light filtering through your window. Let's imagine the quiet dawn, the gentle awakening, the feeling of being connected to the natural world. And let's drift off to sleep, dreaming of a time when mornings were a little bit simpler. And now, the birds are chirping a little louder, the sky is beginning to lighten, which means, for some folks, it's time to get you up. Because, let's face it, relying solely on the sun? That only works if you don't have a job, or if you're a cat. And even cats have standards these days. So, imagine this. You're snuggled deep under your, well, probably not a duvet, more likely a heavy wool blanket. Maybe even a patchwork quilt your great-aunt Mildred made. It's warm, it's cozy, and the last thing you want is to leave its embrace. The faint scent of coal smoke from the neighbor's chimney is still clinging to the air, a reminder of the long night. You're drifting in that delicious, pre-wakefulness haze, that liminal space between dreams and reality, when suddenly, tap, 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 on your window. Not a gentle tap, not a courteous tap, more like a persistent, I'm getting paid for this whether you like it or not kind of tap. This, my friend, is the work of the knocker-upper. Yes, the knocker-upper. Arguably one of the most wonderfully named professions in history. And, for a while, a surprisingly vital one. Their job, quite simply, was to wake you up. For a fee, of course. This wasn't a public service. This was capitalism, baby. Even in the Victorian era, you see, with the rise of factories and industrial work, punctuality became paramount. Show up late, and you're docked pay, or worse, you're out of a job. And no one wanted that. Especially not when you're already breathing in more soot than oxygen. So, people needed a reliable way to ensure they were up and at M before the factory whistle blew. Hence, the knocker-upper. Now, you might be picturing some burly fellow with a sledgehammer. Please don't. That would be terrible for your windows and my sleep-inducing narrative. In reality, the tool of the trade was usually a long, lightweight pole, often made of bamboo or some other flexible wood. Think of it as a really long pointer, like the kind teachers used to use, but instead of pointing at maps, it's pointing at your window. Repeatedly, the knocker-upper would walk their designated route, armed with their trusty pole, tapping on windows until they were sure their client was awake. And I mean sure. They wouldn't just tap and run. Oh no, they had to get confirmation. A shout, a visible movement behind the curtains, something to indicate that you were, indeed, rousing from your slumber. Think about that for a second. Your alarm clock's only job is to make a noise. It doesn't care if you're actually awake. You could be drooling on your pillow, completely oblivious, while your phone blares out the latest pop hit. The knocker-upper, on the other hand, had accountability. Their reputation, their livelihood, depended on their success. If you overslept, it was on them. Talk about job security, or maybe insecurity, depending on how many grumpy, sleep-deprived customers you had. And it wasn't just tapping on windows. Some knocker-uppers employed other, creative methods. Rattling doors, using a pea shooter to fire dried peas at windows, eco-friendly alarm clocks, or even shouting loudly. One particularly dedicated knocker-upper in London, according to some accounts, used a long tube to blow directly into people's ears. I'm not sure which is worse, the window tapping or the forced ear blowing. I guess it depends on how much you value your eardrums. The profession was particularly prevalent in industrial towns and cities, where factory work demanded early starts. Places like Manchester, Sheffield, and, of course, London, were teeming with knocker-uppers. They were as much a part of the urban landscape as the smog and the street urchins. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit for you. Some knocker-uppers were actually police officers supplementing their income. Talk about a side hustle. Imagine being woken up by the long arm of the law literally. Oi, wake up, and pay your taxes. It adds a whole new dimension to the phrase, getting busted. And here's the historical fact. Knocker-uppers were primarily used in England and Ireland, although similar professions existed in other parts of Europe. It was especially common in areas with large working-class populations. Historians still debate the overall impact of the knocker-upper. Some argue that they were essential for maintaining productivity and ensuring the smooth functioning of the industrial economy. Others contend that they were simply a symptom of the harsh working conditions and the lack of adequate social safety nets. Were they entrepreneurial heroes, providing a valuable service? Or were they a reminder of the exploitative nature of Victorian labor? It's all a matter of perspective, really. You can almost hear the echoes of their tapping, can't you? The rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the glass, a gentle or not so gentle reminder that the day is dawning and it's time to face the world. Of course, the knocker-upper, like so many other professions, eventually faded into obscurity with the advent of affordable alarm clocks. Progress, I suppose. Although, I have to admit, there's something undeniably charming about the idea of a person, rather than a machine, being responsible for waking you up. It's a human connection, a small act of service in a world that was often cold and impersonal. Plus, imagine the stories they could tell, the secrets they overheard through thin walls, the glimpses they caught of people's lives before they were fully awake. They were the silent observers of the Victorian morning, the keepers of countless sleepy secrets. And speaking of secrets, you know, it's funny. We talked earlier about how the Victorians were obsessed with covering things up, with propriety and appearances. And yet, here we have the knocker-upper, essentially invading people's privacy every single morning, peeking into bedrooms, ensuring they were awake. It's a fascinating contradiction, isn't it? Perhaps it just goes to show that even the most rigid societies have their cracks, their little inconsistencies. Or maybe they were just really bad at sleeping in. And now, as you drift further towards sleep, imagine the knocker-upper making their rounds. The soft glow of gas lamps illuminating their path, the rhythmic tapping of their pole echoing through the quiet streets. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest hours, there is always someone watching over you. Or, at least, making sure you get to work on time. Sleep well, and try not to dream of dried peas. Alright, settle back in. That knocker-uppers probably moved on to the next street by now. Let's talk about why they were needed in the first place, shall we? Because, let's face it, the romance of the early morning fades pretty quickly when you're not gently coaxed awake by a professional window tapper. Instead, imagine the relentless, soul-crushing demands of the factory. You are now standing on a cobbled street, maybe in Manchester, maybe in Birmingham, sometime in the mid-1800s. The air is thick with coal smoke, that familiar Victorian perfume, you know? A sort of industrial eau de toilette. And even before the sun fully crests the horizon, the streets are already teeming with people. Not leisurely strolling, mind you. No, these folks are hustling. There's a palpable urgency in their steps, a kind of silent, collective dread hanging in the air. You hear the rhythmic clang of machinery in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. That's the siren song of the factory, beckoning, or rather, demanding, its workforce. Think of it. Before the factory system really took hold, work was often dictated by the seasons, by daylight, by the rhythms of agricultural life. You might work hard during harvest time, sure, but there were also periods of relative calm. Now, it's the relentless tick-tock of the machine that sets the pace. And the machine doesn't care if you had a bad dream, or if your kids got a cough, or if you just fancy a lie-in. The machine demands, and that demand translated into incredibly early mornings. We're talking 5 a.m., 4 a.m., sometimes even earlier. Can you imagine? Waking up before the birds, stumbling through the darkness, fueled by nothing but lukewarm tea and the grim determination to avoid getting sacked. It makes hitting snooze on your iPhone feel almost decadent, doesn't it? You see families walking together, the parents looking worn and weary, the children often dragging their feet. Child labor was rampant, a grim reality of the Victorian era. Little ones, as young as 5 or 6, were often put to work in the factories, their tiny hands nimble enough to reach into the machinery. It's a horrifying thought, isn't it? Imagine your kid having to wake up at 4 a.m. to crawl under a loom. Makes you want to invent a time machine just to give everyone a decent cup of coffee and a hug. These early starts weren't just about squeezing every last drop of productivity out of the workforce, though that was certainly a major factor. They were also about maximizing the use of daylight. Remember, electricity was still a relatively new and expensive luxury. Factories relied heavily on natural light to illuminate their workshops. So, the earlier you started, the more you could get done before the sun went down. It was a brutally efficient system, designed to extract maximum output with minimal cost. And the consequences of being late? Dire. Fines were common, and repeated tardiness could lead to dismissal. In a time when jobs were scarce and poverty was widespread, losing your livelihood could be catastrophic. So, you can understand why people were so desperate to wake up on time. It wasn't just about personal discipline, it was about survival. This is where our friend the knocker-upper really earned their keep. They were the last line of defense against unemployment, the human alarm clock that stood between you and the wrath of the factory foreman. They knew the streets, they knew the schedules, and they knew how to rouse even the deepest sleepers. It's interesting to consider the social impact of these early starts. Think about it. Entire communities were structured around the demands of the factory. Meal times, social activities, even religious observances were all dictated by the factory whistle. It created a kind of collective rhythm, a shared experience of early mornings and long, arduous days. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The Factory Act of 1833 was a landmark piece of legislation that attempted to regulate child labor and limit working hours in textile factories. It stipulated that children between the ages of 9 and 13 could work no more than 9 hours a day, and children between 13 and 18 could work no more than 12 hours a day. It also mandated that children receive some form of education. While it was a step in the right direction, enforcement was often lax, and the exploitation of child labor continued for many years. Baby steps, I guess, but here's a slightly quirkier tidbit. There were reports of factory owners deliberately setting their factory clocks ahead, just to squeeze a few extra minutes out of their workers. Can you imagine the audacity? Talk about a trust fall straight into a vat of molten steel. Okay, maybe not molten steel, but you get the idea. It just goes to show how far some people were willing to go to maximize profits, even at the expense of their employees' well-being. And just to keep things spicy, here's a scholarly debate for you. Historians still argue about the extent to which the factory system actually improved the overall standard of living for the working class. Some argue that it provided employment opportunities and access to goods that were previously unavailable. Others contend that it led to widespread poverty, exploitation, and social unrest. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. You might be thinking, well, surely there were alternatives. Surely people weren't just slaves to the factory whistle. And you'd be right, to some extent. Some people worked in smaller workshops, or as artisans, or as domestic servants. But the factory system was undeniably the dominant force in the Victorian economy, and it shaped the lives of millions of people. Remember those roosters we talked about earlier? You might think they were rendered obsolete by the factory whistle. But even in industrial towns, people kept chickens, not just for eggs, but also as a kind of organic alarm clock. A feathered reminder that the day was dawning, even if the factory clock said otherwise. A little bit of country in the heart of the city. The relentless pressure of factory work also led to the development of all sorts of coping mechanisms. People found ways to steal moments of rest, to connect with their fellow workers, to maintain their sense of dignity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. They formed unions, they organized strikes, they fought for better wages and working conditions. They were not simply passive victims. They were active agents in their own history. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those early risers, those men, women, and children who braved the darkness and the drudgery of the factory. Think about the sacrifices they made, the hardships they endured, and the resilience they displayed. And be grateful for your comfortable bed, your modern alarm clock, and the relative freedom you have to choose how you spend your day. And maybe, just maybe, set your alarm for a little bit later tomorrow. You deserve it. Okay, now, imagine the faintest sliver of light creeping through the gaps in your heavy curtains. It's not the harsh, insistent glare of a modern sunrise, more of a gentle suggestion that maybe, just maybe, the day is thinking about starting. You're still deliciously warm under your layers of blankets, probably a couple more than you're used to, considering the drafty nature of Victorian homes. Remember, central heating was a luxury, and you are not necessarily a duchess. But the chill in the air, that little nip that sneaks in even under the covers, reminds you that you can't linger too long. Besides, the aroma, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke, it's calling to you. It's a primal call, really, a promise of warmth and the start of the day's activities. Time for the ritual. You are swinging your legs over the side of the bed, and your bare feet hit the cold floorboards. Yikes. That's enough to wake you up faster than any iPhone alarm, isn't it? You quickly shuffle to where you left your slippers last night. Hopefully you remembered to leave them close. Victorian floors were notoriously unforgiving, especially in winter. Think of it as nature's own knocker-upper, jolting you awake with icy determination. Now the fire. This isn't just about getting warm. It's the central nervous system of the Victorian home. It heats water for tea. It warms the room for dressing. It provides light for those early morning tasks. It's everything, and you are responsible for bringing it to life. You're heading towards the fireplace now, and you notice the carefully laid arrangement from the night before. Someone, maybe you, maybe a servant if you're lucky enough to have one, prepared it all for this moment. Kindling, small, dry twigs, arranged artfully around larger pieces of coal or wood. It's like a little architectural marvel, designed for maximum combustion. You might even find some newspaper crumpled underneath, ready to catch the initial spark. Back then, newspapers were precious, not just for information, but also for practical uses like this. Recycling at its finest, really. You grab the matchbox, feeling the rough texture of the paper against your fingers. Back then, matches weren't quite as reliable as the ones we have today. You might have to strike a couple, or even several, before you get a flame. And the smell, that acrid, sulfurous scent, it's a far cry from the pleasant aroma of a scented candle. But it's the smell of progress, the smell of civilization, the smell of, well, getting warm. You carefully strike the match, shielding the tiny flame with your hand. It flickers, dances, threatens to go out. You hold your breath, willing it to catch. Finally, it takes. A small, steady flame. You gently touch it to the newspaper and watch as it greedily devours the dry paper. Then, the kindling catches, crackling and popping as the flames spread. Ah, there we go. You add a few more small pieces of wood, feeding the nascent fire. You have to be patient. You can't just dump a load of coal on it right away. It needs time to build, to establish itself. It's like nurturing a tiny, fiery baby. And if you mess it up, you have to start all over again. And nobody wants to do that. As the fire grows stronger, you can feel the warmth radiating outwards. It's a welcome sensation, chasing away the chill. You stand there for a moment, just basking in the heat, watching the flames dance. It's mesmerizing, isn't it? A little pocket of cozy in a cold, dark world. Now for the coal. You grab the coal scuttle, a small bucket specifically for carrying coal, and head to the coal cellar. This might be outside, or in a dark corner of the basement. Either way, it's going to be cold and dusty. You fill the scuttle with coal, try not to spill too much. Coal dust gets everywhere. Back at the fireplace, you carefully add the coal to the fire, arranging it so that it doesn't smother the flames. You want it to burn slowly and steadily, providing a consistent source of heat throughout the day. This is an art, really. Too much coal, and you'll suffocate the fire. Too little, and it will burn out too quickly. It's all about balance, and there you have it. The fire is lit. The heart of the Victorian home is beating once more. You can almost feel the house sigh with relief. Now, you can put the kettle on. Because what's a fire without a cup of tea? Historians still debate the environmental impact of all these coal fires burning day in and day out. On one hand, it provided necessary warmth and fuel for industry. On the other hand, it blanketed cities in smog, leading to respiratory problems and generally unpleasant living conditions. London's infamous pea soupers were a direct result of coal burning. It's a classic case of progress having unintended consequences, isn't it? It's funny to think that something so central to Victorian life, the ritual of lighting the fire, is something that most of us barely even think about today. We just flick a switch and poof, instant heat. But there was a certain connection to the natural world that came with having to coax a fire to life each day. A sense of accomplishment, a sense of self-reliance. Plus, you got a good workout hauling coal. Speaking of which, the type of coal you used mattered, too. Cheaper coal burned dirtier and faster, creating more smoke. Wealthier families could afford higher quality coal that burned cleaner and longer. So even something as simple as the type of fuel you used was a reflection of your social status. It's all connected, isn't it? The fire, the coal, your social standing. It's all part of the intricate tapestry of Victorian life. Oh, and here's a quirky little fact for you. Did you know that some Victorians believed that the way a fire burned could predict the future? If the flames were bright and cheerful, it meant good luck was on the way. If they were smoky and sputtering, it meant trouble was brewing. It was basically a Victorian version of reading tea leaves, but with fire. I wonder if they had fire psychics? Probably. You're feeling warmer now, standing by the fire, sipping your tea. The house is slowly waking up, coming to life. You can hear the sounds of the city outside, the clatter of horses' hooves, the distant cries of street vendors, maybe even the faint sound of a knocker-upper doing their rounds several streets over. Remember them? Seems like a lifetime ago when we talked about them, doesn't it? Okay, let's just settle in a little deeper. Pull those covers up. That's it, you're snug in your bed, right? Imagine, just imagine, no alarm clock. Bliss, isn't it? But, eventually, even in this Victorian dreamscape, you do need to, do things. Work calls. The stew isn't going to stir itself. So, how did the less fortunate Victorians, the ones who couldn't afford a fancy timepiece or, a knocker-upper specifically dedicated to their personal window, how did they manage to not be late for everything? Well, necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and in this case, the slightly unreliable father of punctuality. You see, time, before it was meticulously sliced and diced by the clockwork precision of the Industrial Revolution, was, well, it was a bit more fluid. More of a suggestion, really. Think of it like that sourdough starter you've been neglecting in the fridge. It's approximately alive, approximately ready. And for many, the answer to the timekeeping question lay in a far simpler, far more combustible solution, the humble candle. Now, you might be thinking, a candle? Really? That's your big reveal. And yeah, okay, It doesn't sound like much. But bear with me. It's not just about lighting a flame. It's about lighting a specifically calibrated flame. Imagine this. You're a seamstress, let's say. You need to be at the factory by, let's say 6 in the morning. You can't afford some fancy French clock that chimes the hour with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. So what do? You make your own darn clock. You take a candle, probably a cheap tallow candle, because beeswax is for the rich, and you carefully mark it. Little notches, evenly spaced, all the way down. Each notch represents, say, half an hour. You do a test burn, timing how long it takes for the flame to melt down to each mark. You adjust the spacing as needed, taking into account the quality of the tallow, the draft in your room, even the phase of the moon, probably. Okay, maybe not the moon, but you get the idea. It's all very scientific. Sort of. Then, before you go to sleep, you light the candle. You place it in a safe spot, away from flammable materials. Hopefully, fire safety wasn't exactly a Victorian strong suit. And you drift off to sleep, trusting that as the candle burns down, it will eventually reach a strategically placed nail or a bit of wire. That will then what? Well, that's where the fun begins. Some people would attach the nail to a metal plate that would clatter onto a tin tray when the candle burned down far enough. Others would rig up a system where the falling nail would release a small weight, which would then, pull a string attached to your toe? Maybe not. But something equally ingenious and probably slightly terrifying. Think of it as the Victorian version of setting a timer on your phone, except instead of a gentle ding, you get a potential fire hazard and a rude awakening. It's a wonder anyone got any sleep at all, really. Now, before you start picturing entire Victorian households being incinerated by rogue candles, let me reassure you, slightly. Candle clocks weren't exactly known for their pinpoint accuracy. They were more guidelines. A general sense of when it was probably time to get up, which, honestly, is probably how most of us use our snooze buttons anyway. Of course, the quality of the candle mattered a great deal. A cheap, poorly made candle would burn unevenly, sputtering and dripping, and generally being unreliable. A well-made candle, on the other hand, would burn more consistently, providing a, relatively, more accurate measure of time. This brings us to the fascinating and slightly less flammable alternative, the knotted rope. Now, this one is even simpler. You take a length of rope, any old rope will do, and you tie knots in it at regular intervals. Again, you do a test burn. Yes, there's still fire involved, timing how long it takes for the rope to burn from one knot to the next. You can even soak the rope in something flammable, like oil, to make it burn more consistently. Don't do this at home, kids. The idea is the same as the candle clock. You light one end of the rope before you go to sleep, and as it burns, it will eventually reach a knot. When the knot burns through, it will either snap, releasing a weight, or simply create a loud enough pop to wake you up. Again, not exactly precision engineering, but it's something. And here's a fun fact. Variations of these burn time methods were used for centuries before the Victorian era, all over the world. From ancient China to medieval Europe, people have been using candles and ropes to mark the passage of time. It's a testament to human ingenuity and our desperate need to not be late for work. Historians still debate just how widespread these methods were. Were they a common practice in every working-class household, or were they more of a niche solution for those who were particularly desperate or resourceful? The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. We have some written accounts, but it's hard to know how representative they are. Did everyone keep a detailed diary of their candle clock construction techniques? Probably not. It's also worth remembering that time itself was a different concept back then. Without the constant barrage of digital displays and precisely scheduled meetings, people had a more relaxed relationship with the clock. Being a few minutes late wasn't the end of the world. Unless, of course, you were working in a factory, in which case, being late could mean a fine, or even the sack. And let's be honest, even with our modern timekeeping devices, how many of us are actually on time for everything? We might have atomic clocks and GPS-synced smartphones, but we still manage to find ways to be perpetually 5 minutes behind schedule. It's just part of the human condition, I think. So, the next time you're struggling to drag yourself out of bed, remember the poor Victorian seamstress, relying on a flickering candle and a prayer to get her to the factory on time. It might just give you the motivation you need to finally hit the snooze button one last time. And speaking of fire, Remember yesterday's fire lighting rituals? You might think that the soot-covered Victorian would have liked a candle alarm clock to have the fire ready when they woke up. But it was not always so. The fire was so important, and coal was so expensive, that the fire was usually stoked and kept alive all night. If you had to wake up early, you only had to blow the embers and add new coal. But sometimes I wonder, did these makeshift timekeeping devices actually work? Or were they just elaborate placebos, giving people a sense of control over their mornings? Even if they were secretly just relying on the rooster next door to wake them up? Maybe the real secret to Victorian punctuality wasn't the candle or the rope, but the sheer, unadulterated terror of what would happen if they didn't get to work on time. Food for thought, isn't it? Household chores. Before the sun is high. Envision the flurry of activity as families prepared for the day. Okay, so the fire's crackling. Maybe you've even managed a quick cup of that chicory coffee substitute we talked about earlier. Bet you're thrilled about that. But the day isn't going to start itself. You're definitely not hitting snooze. No. The Victorian morning is a doing morning. And that means chores. Glorious, pre-dawn, back-breaking chores. Lucky you stretch, trying to work out the kinks from sleeping on that straw-filled mattress. Remember, luxury was relative back then. And a spring mattress? Pure fantasy for most. You pull on your clothes, probably several layers, because even with that fire, the house is still going to be chilly. And let's be honest, central heating was still just a twinkle in some engineer's eye. You can practically smell the damp in the air, clinging to the fabric. It's invigorating, in a really annoying way. Now, before you even think about breakfast, there's water to fetch. And this isn't a simple trip to the kitchen tap. Nope. You're grabbing buckets and heading out to the well, or maybe even the river if you're rustic. Imagine that crisp morning air hitting your face as you haul those heavy buckets back. Feel those muscles burning. Think of it as your early morning gym session. Except instead of a protein shake afterwards, you get, water. Hydration is important, I guess. The water isn't just for drinking, of course. It's for washing. And by washing, I don't mean a leisurely soak in a hot bath. We're talking about a quick, probably cold, splash of water to the face and hands. Maybe a once-a-week full-body scrub if you're feeling particularly ambitious. Hygiene standards were different. Let's just say that. They certainly weren't adhering to Dr. Bronner's all-one philosophy. And hand sanitizer? Forget about it. You're relying on good old-fashioned grit and a surprisingly resilient immune system. While you're splashing around, someone else in the household, probably a child, because child labor was a thing, is emptying the chamber pots. Yes, you heard that right. Before indoor plumbing became widespread, and that wasn't until well into the 20th century for many people, chamber pots were the toilet of choice. And someone had to empty them. Into the street. Or the garden. Depending on, I don't even want to think about it. Let's just say it wasn't a glamorous job. And it probably contributed to some interesting smells wafting through the neighborhood. Victorian London, I'm guessing, did not smell like roses. Speaking of unpleasant tasks, it's time to think about the animals. If you live in the countryside, or even in a more rural part of a city, you might have chickens, pigs, or even a cow to tend to. They need feeding, watering, and other things cleaned up after. It's a messy business, but it's essential. These animals provide food and, in some cases, income. You are, quite literally, knee-deep in the source of your next meal. Isn't that a comforting thought? And then there's the cleaning. Sweeping floors, usually dirt or stone, dusting, with whatever rags you can find, and generally trying to keep the house from descending into complete squalor. Remember, there's no vacuum cleaner, no Swiffer, no magic eraser. Just elbow grease and a whole lot of determination. And probably a fair amount of dust. You're basically living in a constant state of mild allergy. Now let's talk about laundry. Because that's a joy. If it's laundry day, you're in for a treat. You'll be heating water over the fire, more fuel to chop, scrubbing clothes on a washboard, carpal tunnel, and then hanging them out to dry, weather permitting, of course. And ironing. Forget about electric irons. You're using a heavy, cast iron that you heat on the stove. It's basically like weightlifting while trying to avoid burning your clothes. And yourself. Good luck with that. Interestingly, the Victorian era saw the rise of commercial laundries, particularly in urban areas. These were often staffed by women, and while the work was hard and the conditions were often poor, it did offer a source of income for many. So, progress? Sort of. Baby steps. After all of this, after the water fetching, the chamber pot emptying, the animal tending, the cleaning, and the laundry, if it's that day, you might finally get around to thinking about breakfast. But even that is a chore in itself. You have to prepare the food from scratch, using whatever ingredients you have on hand. There's no popping down to the corner store for a pint of milk and a box of cereal. You're making your own bread, churning your own butter, if you're lucky enough to have a cow, and generally living a life that would make a modern-day foodie weep with either envy or horror. Probably horror. And while all this is going on, the children are being put to work. They're helping with chores, running errands, or, if they're from a poorer family, heading off to work in a factory or a mine. Child labor was a harsh reality of the Victorian era, and it's a stark reminder of how different life was back then. It's easy to romanticize the past, but it's important to remember the hardships that many people faced. Now, here's a little historical tidbit for you. Did you know that the Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness? Despite the lack of modern plumbing and hygiene products, they were constantly trying to find new ways to keep their homes and bodies clean. They experimented with all sorts of bizarre concoctions and contraptions, some of which were effective, and some of which were less so. Let's just say that Victorian hygiene practices were a mixed bag. One popular method for teeth cleaning was charcoal, which, while abrasive, surprisingly did help to whiten the teeth. Though I imagine it made you look like you'd been eating soot. Historians still debate the extent to which Victorian cleanliness was performative versus genuinely effective. On one hand, there was a lot of emphasis on outward appearances and social respectability. A clean house and a well-groomed appearance were seen as signs of moral virtue. On the other hand, there were genuine concerns about disease and sanitation, particularly in crowded urban areas. So, were they truly cleaner than people in previous eras, or were they just better at appearing clean? The jury's still out. As you're finishing up your chores, you might hear the familiar tap-tap-tapping of the knocker-upper, making his rounds to wake up those who rely on his services. Remember him? He's the human alarm clock we talked about earlier. And as the sun finally begins to peek over the horizon, you can feel a sense of accomplishment. You've made it through another Victorian morning. You've fetched the water, emptied the chamber pots, tended to the animals, cleaned the house, and prepared breakfast. You've earned your keep. Now it's time to face the day, and whatever challenges it may bring. But first, maybe another cup of that chicory coffee. You deserve it. All right, settle back in. You've survived the pre-dawn chill, the frantic fire lighting, and possibly even a slightly terrifying encounter with a knocker-upper. Now, finally, reward awaits. It's breakfast time. You shuffle towards the kitchen, or perhaps the scullery if you're fancy, and have one of those. The air is thick with the promise of something warm and, well, probably not exciting, but definitely warm. Remember that fire you, or someone else, wrestled into existence. It's now doing its job, radiating a comforting heat that's slowly thawing your bones. The Victorian breakfast, it's a thing. A hearty thing. A thing designed to fuel you through hours of back-breaking labor, or at least, through hours of pretending to be busy while subtly judging the cut of your neighbor's frock coat. Either way, energy is needed. Imagine, if you will, a plate piled high. Now, depending on your social standing, that pile might look drastically different. If you're part of the upper crust, you might be presented with a veritable feast. Kidneys, deviled bones, whatever those are, grilled fish, perhaps a chop or two. Maybe even some eggs, if the hens are feeling generous. It's basically a carnivore's dream, and you're probably thinking, wow, that's intense for breakfast. And you'd be right. It is. But remember, these are the people who can afford to eat like this every single day. They're fueled by privilege and protein. But let's be real, most of us aren't rolling in dough, or should I say, rolling in kidneys. So, let's dial it back to the breakfast of the average Victorian Joe or Josephine. What are you likely to be facing? Well, you're probably looking at some form of porridge. Oatmeal, perhaps. Or maybe something called gruel, which sounds, well, it sounds exactly like it probably tastes. Watery, bland, and vaguely depressing. But hey, it's filling. And you can always jazz it up with a bit of treacle or a spoonful of jam if you're lucky. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of a protein shake. Except without the protein, or the shake, or really anything remotely resembling enjoyment. Bread is another staple. Probably stale, possibly moldy, but definitely bread. You might dip it in your tea, which we'll get to in a minute, to soften it up a bit. Waste not, want not, as they say. And honestly, after a few days of gnawing on hardtack, even slightly stale bread starts to taste pretty good. It's all about perspective, right? And speaking of tea, tea. The lifeblood of the British Empire. You're definitely having tea. Strong, black tea. Probably with a splash of milk, if you can afford it. Sugar is a luxury, but a coveted one. That caffeine jolt is essential for facing the day, especially if you've been up since the crack of dawn doing chores that would make a modern gym-goer weep. Now, here's a fun fact for you. The Victorian era saw a massive increase in the consumption of sugar. We're talking sugar everywhere. In your tea, on your porridge, in your cakes. If you're lucky enough to have cake for breakfast, don't get your hopes up. This wasn't just about satisfying a sweet tooth. It was also about fueling those long, grueling workdays. Think of it as an early form of energy drink. Except, less chemically engineered and more ethically questionable, considering where all that sugar came from. And here's a slightly quirkier tidbit. Some Victorians believed that eating certain foods for breakfast could influence your mood and behavior for the rest of the day. So, if you were feeling particularly grumpy, you might be advised to eat something light and cheerful, like, probably more porridge, but maybe with a slightly brighter colored jam. The power of suggestion is a powerful thing, even when you're desperately trying to convince yourself that watery oats are cheerful. Historians still argue about the exact nutritional content of the average Victorian breakfast. Some claim that the working class were shockingly undernourished, relying on cheap, low-quality ingredients that provided little actual sustenance. Others argue that they were surprisingly resourceful, finding ways to supplement their diets with foraged foods and clever cooking techniques. It's a debate that boils down to access to resources and the true impact of Victorian-era poverty. But regardless of the exact composition of your breakfast, one thing is certain: it was a social affair. Families would gather around the table, or, more likely, a shared plank of wood, sharing stories, discussing the day ahead, and generally trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a world that was rapidly changing. It was a moment of connection, a brief respite from the relentless demands of Victorian life. You might be sitting next to your spouse, silently acknowledging the exhaustion etched on each other's faces. Or maybe you're listening to your children chatter excitedly about their plans for the day, completely oblivious to the hardships that lie ahead. Whatever the scene, breakfast is a moment of shared experience, a reminder that you're not alone in this crazy, soot-filled world. And while you're savoring that, probably lukewarm, cup of tea, you might spare a thought for the knocker-upper, who is now probably enjoying his own breakfast, fueled by the satisfaction of a job well done, and maybe a few extra pennies slipped his way by grateful or terrified customers. Or maybe you're thinking about that candle clock from yesterday, wondering if you can rig up a better version using old pickle jars. You finish your breakfast, feeling slightly more fortified and definitely more caffeinated. You steel yourself for the day ahead, knowing that it will be filled with challenges, both big and small. But you also know that you're not facing it alone. You have your family, your community, and the collective memory of generations who have faced similar hardships before you. And hey, at least you don't have to worry about someone banging on your window with a stick anymore. Progress, right? Now, take a deep breath. The day is calling. But before you go, maybe just one more sip of that tea. And now, with a belly full of, shall we say, interesting breakfast, remember that dripping toast? It's time to face the day and your personal hygiene, or lack thereof, depending on how enthusiastic you are about cold water. Washing up in Victorian times wasn't quite the luxurious, multi-step process we know today. Forget your exfoliating scrubs, your hyaluronic acid serums, and your, but washes. It was more pragmatic. Think of it as a quick, efficient, and potentially teeth-chattering affair. You find yourself standing in front of a washstand. It's a simple piece of furniture, usually made of wood, with a basin set into the top. There's a pitcher of water, hopefully not too cold, but let's be realistic, it probably is, and a towel hanging nearby. No fluffy Egyptian cotton here, mind you. More like a slightly scratchy linen affair that's seen better days. The water is drawn from a well or a rain barrel, maybe even the same water used to, let's just say water was precious and recycling was a way of life, even if they didn't call it that. You splash some of the icy liquid onto your face, rubbing it around with your hands. It's bracing, to say the least. It definitely wakes you up, possibly with a gasp. You can almost feel your pores slamming shut in protest. Soap is available, but it's not the fragrant, moisturizing kind we're used to. Victorian soap was often harsh and alkaline, made from animal fats and lye. It did the job of cleaning, but it could also leave your skin feeling dry and irritated. Think of it as the original industrial strength cleanser. Some of the fancier soaps might have added scents like lavender or rose, but for most people, it was a purely functional item. You quickly lather up your hands and wash your face and neck. Maybe a quick swipe under the arms, if you're feeling particularly diligent. Remember, full-body bathing wasn't an everyday occurrence for most people, especially those in the working class. It was more of a weekly or even monthly event, often done in a shared tub or even a river, weather permitting, of course, and the Thames. Well, let's not talk about the Thames. Now, about those teeth. Dental hygiene was, shall we say, primitive. Toothbrushes existed, but they weren't as readily available or as effective as ours. They were often made from animal bristles set into a bone or wooden handle. Imagine the aroma after a few uses. Toothpaste was also a far cry from the minty fresh concoctions we enjoy today. It might have been a powder made from ingredients like charcoal, chalk, or even crushed brick. Yes, you read that right. Crushed brick. Think of it as a very aggressive exfoliant for your gums. It probably did more harm than good. But hey, they were trying. Historians still argue about the extent to which oral hygiene practices impacted overall health in Victorian times. Some believe that poor dental care contributed significantly to various illnesses, while others argue that diet and other factors played a more significant role. What we do know is that tooth decay and gum disease were rampant, and dentures were a common sight, especially among the older generation. And these weren't the comfortable, well-fitting dentures we have today. These were often ill-fitting, uncomfortable, and prone to slippage. Imagine trying to eat dripping toast with a set of dentures that are determined to escape. Not a pretty picture. You rinse your mouth with water, again, probably cold, and wipe your face with the scratchy towel. You're cleanish. At least, you're presentable enough to face the day. And let's be honest, compared to some of your neighbors, you're practically glowing with cleanliness. Now, for a quirky little fact, did you know that some Victorians believed that wearing gloves could help prevent the spread of disease? The idea was that gloves would create a barrier between your hands and any germs you might encounter. Of course, they didn't know about germs in the way we do today, but they had a sense that something invisible was causing illness. So, gloves became a popular accessory, not just for fashion, but also for perceived hygiene. The irony, of course, is that those gloves probably weren't washed very often, making them a breeding ground for, well, you get the idea. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. There was a brief period when some people experimented with using urine as a mouthwash. Yes, you read that correctly. Urine. The reasoning was that ammonia, a component of urine, has antibacterial properties. Now, before you gag, keep in mind that this wasn't a widespread practice, and it was quickly abandoned as better options became available. But it's a reminder that people were willing to try some pretty unconventional things in the name of hygiene. Let's just be thankful that trend didn't stick around. Imagine the minty fresh options we'd have at the supermarket today. New. Peppermint piss. One mainstream historical fact that's important to remember is that access to clean water and sanitation was a major problem for many Victorian cities. Overcrowding, poor infrastructure, and a lack of understanding about hygiene led to widespread disease. Cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses were common, especially in the poorer parts of town. It wasn't until the late 19th century that significant improvements were made in public health, thanks to the efforts of reformers like Edwin Chadwick, who advocated for better sanitation and clean water supplies. So, the next time you turn on the tap and enjoy a glass of clean, safe water, remember that it's a privilege that wasn't always available. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least they didn't have to deal with the pressures of modern beauty standards. But you'd be wrong. While they didn't have Instagram filters or airbrushing, Victorians still had their own ideals of beauty. Pale skin was highly prized, as it was seen as a sign of wealth and leisure. Women went to great lengths to achieve a pale complexion, sometimes using dangerous substances like arsenic or lead. Please, for the love of all that is good, do not try that at home. Or anywhere. Ever. And remember those tight corsets we talked about earlier? They weren't just about creating a fashionable silhouette. They were also about achieving a certain body shape that was considered desirable. So, while the methods may have been different, the pressure to conform to beauty standards was just as real. You might also be thinking about your hair. For women, hair was a symbol of femininity and beauty. Long, flowing locks were highly valued, and women often spent a great deal of time and effort styling their hair. They used various combs, brushes, and hairpins to create elaborate updos and curls. Hair washing was less frequent than it is today, often done only once a week or even less. To keep their hair looking clean and fresh, they might use dry shampoos made from powders like orris root or starch. And for the gentlemen, well, beards were all the rage. And mustaches. The bigger, the better. Think handlebar mustaches that could rival a walrus. They used waxes and pomades to keep their facial hair perfectly sculpted. So, as you finish your abbreviated morning ablutions, take a moment to appreciate the conveniences we have today. Hot running water, effective soap, toothpaste that doesn't contain crushed brick. These are all things we take for granted, but they make a big difference in our daily lives. And remember, even though Victorian hygiene practices might seem primitive to us, they were doing the best they could with the resources they had. And hey, at least they were trying to smell nice, even if it meant resorting to questionable methods. Now, go forth and conquer the day, armed with your, relatively, clean face and your knowledge of Victorian-era hygiene. And maybe, just maybe, take a little extra time to appreciate your next shower. You've earned it. After all, you nearly drank crushed brick this morning. All right, settle in, because now we dress. Dressing the part in Victorian times. Oh boy, this wasn't exactly throwing on a t-shirt and some leggings, was it? Imagine, if you will, that you are about to embark on a multi-layered odyssey of fabric, whalebone, and, well, more fabric. First, you pull on your chemise. This is your base layer, your linen or cotton shield against the everything that's about to come. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of your pajamas, but less comfortable and definitely less cute. It's loose, it's simple, it's meant to absorb sweat and protect your outer garments. You wouldn't want to soil your good corset, after all. Now, the stockings. Silk or cotton, depending on your social standing or your budget. They are held up with garters, which, let's be honest, probably weren't the most reliable things in the world. Can you imagine constantly having to subtly hike up your stockings all day? The struggle is real, even in the 1800s. And now, the corset. Deep breath. This isn't the fetishized, hypersexualized corset you might see in a modern-day burlesque show. This is a functional, albeit restrictive, garment designed to shape your torso into the desired silhouette. Historians still argue whether corsets were instruments of torture or supportive undergarments. Some argue they provided back support, like a really intense, bone-filled back brace, while others claim they were purely about aesthetics and social control. You slip it on, or, more likely, have your maid slip it on for you, because good luck doing that yourself. It's stiff, it's structured, and it's probably a little bit damp? Okay, maybe that's just your imagination. But seriously, imagine wearing layers of fabric in a house that's heated by a fireplace. Things get a little ripe. Your maid, or you if you're a particularly skilled contortionist, starts to lace it up. You hold your breath, literally, as she pulls the laces tighter and tighter. You feel your ribs compress, your waist cinch in, and your internal organs, well, they shift. Let's just say digestion might be a little interesting today. The goal is the hourglass figure, the epitome of Victorian beauty. A small waist, a full bust, and wide hips. It's all about creating the illusion of perfect proportions. And if you can't achieve it naturally, well, that's what padding is for. We'll get to that in a minute. Once the corset is laced, you put on your chemise over it. This is important. You don't want the corset rubbing directly against your skin. Chafing is never fun, especially when whalebone is involved. Next comes the bustle. This delightful contraption is designed to create a pronounced rear silhouette. It's basically a padded cushion that you strap around your waist, giving the illusion of a larger, more rounded backside. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of butt implants, but less permanent and, arguably, less comfortable. Some bustles were simple padded rolls, while others were elaborate cages made of metal or wicker. Imagine sitting down with one of those things on. It's like having a small, uncomfortable shelf attached to your backside. Then comes the petticoat, or petticoats, plural. These are layers of skirts worn under your dress to add volume and shape. They can be made of cotton, linen, or even horsehair, depending on the desired effect. You slip on 1, 2, maybe even 3 petticoats. You feel like you're wearing a small tent. You try to walk, but the fabric swishes and rustles around your legs. It's like trying to navigate a crowded room while wearing a sleeping bag. Now, finally, the dress. This is the main event, the star of the show. It can be made of silk, velvet, wool, or any number of other fabrics. It can be simple or elaborate, depending on the occasion and your social standing. You step into the dress, and your maid fastens it up the back. Buttons, hooks, or laces, depending on the style. You feel the weight of the fabric settle around you. It's heavy, it's constricting, and it's beautiful. The sleeves are long and fitted. The neckline is high and demure. Unless you're going for a scandalous low-cut look, which, let's be honest, probably wasn't that scandalous by today's standards. The skirt is long and flowing, sweeping the floor as you walk, or, more accurately, waddle. Now, accessories. Because no Victorian outfit is complete without a few well-chosen embellishments. Gloves. Always gloves. These protect your hands from the elements, and, more importantly, signal that you are a lady of refinement. Short gloves for daytime, longer gloves for evening. Leather, silk, or even lace, depending on the occasion. A hat or bonnet. This is essential for any outdoor excursion. It protects your face from the sun and adds a touch of elegance to your ensemble. Feathers, ribbons, flowers, the possibilities are endless. Jewelry. A necklace, earrings, a brooch. A subtle statement of your wealth and taste. Maybe a locket containing a lock of hair from a loved one. Morbid, but romantic, right? And finally, shoes. Boots or slippers, depending on the occasion. Practical and sturdy, but hopefully also stylish. Remember, you'll be spending a lot of time on your feet, so comfort is key, or at least a relative key, considering everything else you're wearing. So, there you have it. The Victorian morning dressing ritual. It's time-consuming, it's complicated, and it's definitely not for the faint of heart. But it's also a fascinating glimpse into a world where appearances mattered, where clothing was a symbol of status and identity. And, frankly, you're probably exhausted just thinking about it. All those layers, all those laces, all that fabric. I think I need a nap just describing it. But before you drift off completely, consider this. The average Victorian woman spent hours each day just getting dressed. Can you imagine? No wonder they were so obsessed with etiquette and social graces. They had nothing else to do but perfect their manners while they were being laced into their corsets. And one last quirky tidbit. Some Victorian women actually wore dress improvers, which were basically inflatable cushions that they could adjust throughout the day to change the shape of their skirts. Talk about a fashion statement. Now close your eyes. Imagine the rustling of the petticoats, the gentle tug of the corset laces, the weight of the fabric on your skin. You are a Victorian lady, ready to face the day. Or, more likely, ready to collapse into a fainting couch. But either way, you look fabulous. And now, as the first rays of, hopefully, sun begin to filter through your window. I say hopefully, because, let's be honest, Victorian England wasn't exactly known for its perpetual sunshine. You'd be turning your thoughts, along with what little warmth you've managed to coax from the embers of last night's fire, remember that section, towards something a little more spiritual. Because, my friend, it's time for morning prayer. Imagine, if you will, the quiet. The relative quiet, anyway. The clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen is likely already underway, a gentle percussion of domesticity, but there's a different kind of stillness hanging in the air, a stillness born not just of the hour, but of intention. You rise from your bed, or, more likely, your shared bed if you're living in cramped quarters, and before you even think about splashing water on your face, before you even consider the Herculean task of wrestling yourself into those layers of Victorian clothing, you kneel, or stand, or sit, depending on your denomination, your personal preference, and frankly, how creaky your knees are feeling this morning. The point is, you're taking a moment, a deliberate pause in the headlong rush of the day, to acknowledge something bigger than yourself. Now, even if you're not particularly religious yourself, and, let's be real, a lot of us aren't, try to appreciate the sheer pervasive influence that religion had on Victorian life. It wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence. It dictated their morals, their their social interactions, their understanding of the world, and yes, even their daily routines. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of checking your phone first thing in the morning. Except instead of doom scrolling through Twitter, you're reciting the Lord's Prayer. Arguably, a healthier way to start the day, really. Though, admittedly, less likely to provide you with juicy celebrity gossip. For many Victorian families, morning prayer was a communal affair. The head of the household, typically the father, would lead the family in prayer, perhaps reading a passage from the Bible. It was a moment of unity, a chance to set the tone for the day, and a reminder of their shared values and beliefs. It was also, let's be honest, a way for the head of the household to assert his authority. You know, just in case anyone was forgetting who was in charge. And let's not forget the children. Oh, the children. Imagine trying to wrangle a gaggle of sleepy, possibly grumpy, Victorian children into a moment of silent contemplation before they've even had their breakfast. It's a recipe for chaos, I tell you. A recipe for chaos. Though, perhaps the threat of eternal damnation was a more effective deterrent than timeout corners. Just a thought. But beyond the family setting, morning prayer also played a significant role in Victorian society as a whole. Churches were often packed on Sunday mornings, and religious organizations were heavily involved in charitable work and social reform. Religion provided a framework for understanding the world and a source of comfort and hope in a time of rapid social and economic change. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Queen Victoria herself was a devout Christian and saw her role as monarch as divinely ordained. She believed that it was her duty to uphold Christian values and to promote morality throughout the empire. And, you know, casually rule over a quarter of the world's population. No pressure, but it wasn't just the Queen. Many prominent Victorians, from politicians to writers to scientists, were deeply influenced by their religious beliefs. Think of William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery campaigner, or Florence Nightingale, the pioneering nurse. Their faith was a driving force behind their work and their commitment to social justice. And now for your quirky/fringe tidbit. There was a rather peculiar, and thankfully short-lived, movement in the mid-Victorian era advocating for spiritual telegraphy. The idea was that devout individuals, through intense prayer and meditation, could actually transmit messages telepathically across vast distances. Imagine the possibilities. Forget the postal service. Just beam your letters directly into the recipient's brain. Needless to say, it didn't exactly catch on. Although, I suppose you could argue that prayer itself is a form of spiritual telegraphy, just without the guaranteed delivery. And what about the scholarly debate, you ask? Well, historians still argue about the extent to which religious belief was genuine and deeply held, versus a matter of social convention and outward conformity. Were Victorians truly pious, or were they simply performing piety? Was religion a genuine source of comfort and meaning, or a tool for social control? It's a complex question with no easy answers, and it's one that continues to fascinate historians today. Some argue that the emphasis on morality and self-discipline was a way for the upper classes to maintain their power and control over the working classes. Others argue that religion provided a sense of community and belonging for those who were struggling with poverty and hardship. And still others argue that it was a bit of both. Because, let's be honest, history is rarely black and white. It's usually a messy, complicated shade of gray. But regardless of the motivations behind it, there's no denying the profound impact that religion had on the Victorian morning routine. It was a moment of reflection, a moment of connection, and a moment of preparation for the day ahead. It was a reminder of their values, their beliefs, and their place in the world. And, perhaps most importantly, it was a moment of quiet. A brief respite from the hustle and bustle of Victorian life, before the factories started churning, before the streets filled with traffic, before the demands of the day began to weigh heavily on their shoulders. So, as you lie here, drifting off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate the power of a quiet moment. A moment of reflection, a moment of gratitude, a moment of connection. Even if you're not religious, there's something to be said for taking a pause in the headlong rush of life, to simply be still and to be present. And who knows, maybe you'll even find yourself sending a little spiritual telegraphy of your own. To the universe, to your loved ones, to yourself. After all, it couldn't hurt, right? Now close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the gentle rhythm of your breath carry you away to, well, hopefully not Victorian England. unless you're really into that sort of thing. But somewhere peaceful, somewhere calm, somewhere where the only sound you can hear is the gentle whisper of your own thoughts. Sweet dreams. Okay, deep breaths. In, out. Let's commute. Setting off. Commuting in the Victorian era asterisk. You've said your morning prayers, wrestled yourself into approximately 17 layers of clothing. Seriously, who needs a weighted blanket when you've got a corset? And you're finally ready to face the day. But how do you face the day when facing the day means getting to work, likely in a bustling, smog-choked city center? Well, unlike today, you probably don't have a car. Unless you're, like, super fancy and own one of those newfangled motor cars. But even then, the roads are, well, let's just say they're not exactly designed for internal combustion engines. More like external manure distribution. So, let's assume you're like most people, you're hoofing it. You step out onto the street, and immediately you're assaulted by a symphony of, well, let's call it urban ambience. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the rumble of carts laden with goods, the cries of street vendors hawking their wares. Fresh oysters. Get your fresh oysters here. And the ever-present aroma of the city. It's a potent mix, a sensory overload that would make your modern noise-canceling headphones spontaneously combust. You are walking, carefully navigating the uneven cobblestones. You notice a group of children playing a game with hoops and sticks, their laughter momentarily cutting through the urban din. A chimney sweep, face blackened with soot, brushes past you, muttering apologies. You pull your shawl tighter, trying to ward off the chill morning air and the particulate matter. The first option, and probably the most common, is walking. And I don't mean a leisurely stroll. I mean a brisk, purposeful march. You're not getting any participation trophies for this, folks. Time is money, and your employer isn't paying you to admire the architecture, which, let's be honest, is probably covered in a fine layer of grime anyway. Walking is free, which is a major plus if you're on a tight budget, but it's also time-consuming. If you live any significant distance from your workplace, you're looking at a serious chunk of your day devoted to simply getting there. And remember, those 17 layers of clothing? Yeah, they're not exactly breathable. Prepare to arrive at work slightly ripe. You pass a water pump, where several women are filling buckets. You remember reading about the cholera outbreaks that plagued Victorian cities, and you're suddenly very grateful for modern plumbing. You make a mental note to appreciate your toilet later. If you're feeling a little more flush, or if your workplace is further afield, you might opt for a horse-drawn omnibus. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of a bus, but with more horse. These lumbering vehicles were a common sight in larger cities, offering a relatively affordable and convenient way to travel. You spot an omnibus approaching, its brass fittings gleaming in the weak sunlight. You jostle for position with other commuters, hoping to snag a seat inside. The omnibus is crowded, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies. You manage to squeeze onto a narrow bench, your knees pressed against the knees of a portly gentleman reading a newspaper. However, be warned, the omnibus wasn't exactly a smooth ride. Cobblestones, remember? And suspension technology wasn't exactly cutting edge. Prepare to be jostled, bumped, and generally rattled about like a pea in a pod. Plus, you're sharing the space with a whole host of interesting characters. Pickpockets, street urchins, ladies with enormous hats adorned with taxidermied birds. The omnibus was a veritable melting pot of Victorian society. Speaking of which, did you know that wearing feathers became incredibly popular in the Victorian era? I mean, incredibly popular. So much so that some species of birds were nearly driven to extinction because of the demand for their plumage. Historians still debate the exact reasons for this ornithological obsession. Was it a symbol of wealth? A fashion statement? Or were Victorians simply bird-brained? Sorry, I couldn't resist. For the truly wealthy, there was always the option of a private carriage. Imagine gliding through the streets in your own personal conveyance, drawn by a team of perfectly groomed horses. You'd be the envy of all the other commuters, a veritable beacon of wealth and status. You see a private carriage pass by, its occupants looking down their noses at the hoi polloi. You roll your eyes, muttering something about the idle rich. You can't help but feel a pang of envy, though. The carriage does look rather comfortable, but even the wealthy weren't immune to the challenges of Victorian commuting. Traffic congestion was a major problem, especially in the heart of the city, and the roads were often poorly maintained, making for a bumpy and uncomfortable ride, even in the fanciest of carriages. Plus, there was the ever-present risk of accidents. Runaway horses, overturned carts, collisions with other vehicles. The streets of Victorian cities were a dangerous place. And let's not forget the weather. Rain, snow, fog. The Victorian climate was notoriously unpredictable. Imagine trying to navigate the streets in a downpour, your clothes soaked, your umbrella blown inside out, and your mood steadily deteriorating. Now, here's a slightly more unconventional mode of transport that sometimes cropped up, especially in areas near canals or rivers: passenger boats. Yes, you could, in theory, hop on a small boat and be ferried to your destination. Think of it as the Victorian Uber boat. Of course, this was heavily dependent on geography and whether your workplace happened to be conveniently located near a waterway. But it was an option. You pass a canal, and you see a small boat ferrying passengers across the water. You consider taking it, but you decide against it. You're not entirely sure you trust the boat's seaworthiness. And then there's the underground. Construction started in the 1860s. Now, while that might conjure up images of our modern, relatively clean and efficient subway systems, the first iterations of the Victorian underground were something else. Imagine a steam-powered train chugging through a tunnel filled with smoke and soot. The air was thick with the smell of coal, and the noise was deafening. It was hardly a pleasant experience, but it was a quick way to get around, especially if you were traveling long distances. You hear the rumble of a train beneath your feet. You remember reading about the construction of the underground, and you shudder. You're not sure you're brave enough to venture into those dark, smoky tunnels. Fun fact: the Metropolitan Railway, which was the first underground railway in the world, originally used gas lighting inside the carriages. Can you imagine the fumes? I mean, talk about a recipe for a headache. But hey, at least you could see where you were going, sort of. And here's a slightly quirky, fringe tidbit. Some enterprising individuals even offered rickshaw-like services, pulling passengers in small carts. Talk about a workout. Imagine being paid to haul someone through the streets of London. You'd certainly earn your keep. So, as you make your way to work, consider the challenges faced by Victorian commuters. The long walks, the crowded omnibuses, the dangerous streets, the unpredictable weather. And be grateful for your modern modes of transport, even if they do sometimes involve traffic jams and delayed trains. At least you don't have to worry about dodging horse manure. Usually, and as you finally arrive at your destination, slightly frazzled but mostly intact, take a moment to appreciate the sheer resilience and resourcefulness of the Victorian people. They may not have had cars or airplanes, but they found ways to navigate their bustling cities and make their way in the world. And that, my friends, is something to admire. Now, wasn't that just a little bit boring? Good. The sounds of the city awakening envision the clatter of horses and the cries of street vendors. Okay, deep breaths. You're starting to stir now. The faintest hint of light is creeping through the gaps in your curtains, or perhaps, more realistically, through the cracks in your shutters. Remember, double-pane windows are a long way off. You're not quite awake, but you're no longer fully asleep. That liminal space, the one between dreams and reality, is where we're at. And now you hear it. It starts subtly, a low rumble that vibrates through the floorboards. It's the city awakening, not with a gentle birdsong symphony, but with the decidedly more robust sounds of commerce. Imagine the first carts are starting to roll. Those early delivery wagons, pulled by sturdy horses, are already making their way down cobblestone streets. You hear the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves, a sound that would become utterly commonplace, a white noise of Victorian life. It's almost hypnotic. Clip-clop, clip-clop, feel your eyelids getting heavy. And then, the cries begin. The street vendors. Bless their entrepreneurial hearts, they are enthusiastic. No quiet, polite announcements here. They're selling everything from fresh fish, hopefully relatively fresh, to matches, and they want everyone to know it. Fresh fish. Get your fresh fish here. Best catch of the morning. One shouts, his voice already hoarse at what, for you, is still basically the middle of the night. You can almost smell the brine, can't you? Let's hope your imagination is a little more forgiving than reality might have been. Another voice, shriller and perhaps a little more annoying, pierces through the general din. Matches. Matches for sale. Light your fires, good sirs and madams. You can practically see him, A skinny lad with a smudge of soot on his cheek, darting between the carts, trying to make a penny or two. It's a hustle, baby. A Victorian hustle. These sounds, layered on top of each other, form the soundtrack to the Victorian morning. It's a far cry from the curated playlist we use to ease ourselves into the day, isn't it? No gentle acoustic guitar here, just the raw, unfiltered sounds of urban life. Quick modern aside, I sometimes wonder what people 100 years from now will think of our morning routines. Will they find the sound of a coffee grinder and the ping of a microwave oven as quaint as we find the cries of a fishmonger? Probably not. They'll probably be horrified by our reliance on screens first thing in the morning. They stared into glowing rectangles before they even spoke to another human being. How barbaric. Now, back to the Victorian era. You pull your blanket a little closer, trying to block out the noise, but it's no use. The city is awake, and whether you like it or not, you are too. This is your wake-up call, courtesy of the free market. One of the most fascinating things about this early morning cacophony is that it wasn't just random noise. It was a carefully orchestrated system of communication. Each vendor had their own specific cry, their own unique melody, designed to attract attention and distinguish them from the competition. It was, in a way, the Victorian equivalent of branding. And speaking of branding, here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Many of the brand names we know and love today got their start in the Victorian era. Think about it. Cadbury, Heinz, Pears soap. These companies were all vying for attention in a crowded marketplace, and their success was often due to clever marketing and, yes, even the sounds associated with their products. The milkman's cry, for example, became synonymous with fresh dairy, a trusted sound that families relied on. But it wasn't just the vendors who contributed to the morning symphony. You also hear the rumble of omnibuses, the horse-drawn buses that were the primary mode of public transportation. These weren't the sleek, modern buses we know today. They were lumbering, uncomfortable vehicles, often overcrowded and always noisy. But they were a vital part of the urban landscape, ferrying workers to factories and offices across the city. And then there are the street sweepers. Bless them, they are trying. Armed with brooms and shovels, they attempt to keep the streets clean, battling against a never-ending tide of mud, manure, and general unpleasantness. You hear the swish, swish of their brooms, a small but valiant effort against the forces of urban grime. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that some Victorians believed that the sound of church bells could ward off evil spirits? It's true. Many churches rang their bells early in the morning, not just to call people to prayer, but also to cleanse the city of negative energy. So, that pealing you hear in the distance? It might just be protecting you from, well, who knows what kind of Victorian-era ghouls. And that brings us to a scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the impact of noise pollution on Victorian society. Was the constant din of the city simply an accepted part of life, or did it have a detrimental effect on people's health and well-being? Some argue that it contributed to the high rates of nervous disorders and mental illness that were prevalent during the period. Others maintain that people simply adapted to the noise and learned to tune it out. I, personally, would have needed earplugs. Just saying. Asterisk country mornings. Nature's gentle alarm asterisk experienced the sounds and sights of a rural Victorian awakening. All right, settle in, friend. Let's trade the cacophony of the city for, well, a different kind of cacophony. We're heading to the countryside. Think rolling hills, dew-kissed meadows, and, yeah, a whole lot of animal noises. You're waking up in a small cottage. Not one of those fancy, sprawling estates you read about in novels. This is a working farm, and you're likely a member of the family, or perhaps a farmhand. The first thing you notice isn't the light streaming through the window, although there is some of that, diffused by the slightly grubby glass. It's the sound. It's a symphony of rural life, conducted by the rising sun. First, there's the rooster. Oh, the rooster. He doesn't believe in gradual awakenings. He's not about easing you into the day. No, sir. He's a feathered drill sergeant, bellowing his existence to the world with the force of a tiny, angry opera singer. You can almost feel the vibrations in your teeth. You wonder, not for the first time, if rooster stew might be on the menu soon. That's a thought for later. Then, layered on top of the rooster's enthusiastic performance, you hear the gentle mooing of cows in the distance. They're patiently waiting to be milked, their udders full and probably a little uncomfortable. You can almost smell the earthy aroma of the barn, a mix of hay, manure, and, well, cow. It's not unpleasant exactly, just potent. And then, there's the bleating of sheep. A chorus of fluffy complaints, each one vying for attention. You imagine them jostling for position, eager to get to the freshest patches of grass. You briefly consider trying to count them, but quickly abandon that idea. You know how that ends. The light begins to creep further into the room. It's not the harsh, direct sunlight you might get in a modern house with perfectly aligned windows. It's softer, filtered through the trees and the slightly dusty panes. You notice the motes of dust dancing in the beams, a tiny galaxy swirling in the air. You're lying on a straw-filled mattress, covered with a thick, woolen blanket. It's a little scratchy, but surprisingly warm. You can smell the faint scent of lanolin, a reminder of the sheep that provided the wool. It's not exactly the memory foam mattress you might be used to, but it's adequate. Remember those layers of clothing we talked about? Well, even in the countryside, you're not escaping them. The chill of the morning air seeps into the cottage, making you appreciate the multiple layers of linen and wool that await you. You pull on your stockings, your chemise, and then your day dress, probably a simple, practical garment made of sturdy fabric. Corsets might be for special occasions, or for those higher up the social ladder, but not for everyday farm work. You need to be able to breathe, after all. Now, before you even think about breakfast, there's work to be done. Out here, everyone pitches in. It's not like the city, where you might have specialized trades. Here, you're a jack of all trades, ready to tackle whatever the day throws at you. You head outside, and the fresh, crisp air hits you full in the face. It's invigorating, even if it is a bit cold. The dew-covered grass glistens in the morning light, and the air smells clean and earthy. You might be assigned to help with the milking, a task that requires patience and a steady hand. Or perhaps you'll be feeding the chickens, scattering grain, and collecting eggs. Or maybe you'll be heading out to the fields to help with the harvest, depending on the season. One thing's for sure, you won't be idle. It's interesting to consider how deeply ingrained this connection to nature was for rural Victorians. Their lives were dictated by the rhythms of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, and the needs of the animals and crops. They didn't have the luxury of ignoring these natural cues. Now, a quirky little tidbit for you. Some rural communities actually did have a sort of human alarm clock system, but it was far less formal than the knocker-uppers of the city. Often, it was just a matter of neighbors looking out for each other. If someone knew you needed to be up early for market, they might give you a shout as they passed by. Think of it as a very early, very low-tech neighborhood watch, but for sleep schedules. It was less of a paid service and more of a social obligation. And what about the scholarly debates? Well, historians still argue about the degree to which rural life was romanticized in Victorian literature and art. Was it really as idyllic as it was often portrayed, or was it a harsh and unforgiving existence? The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. There was beauty and hardship, community and isolation, all intertwined in the fabric of rural life. Think about the role of folklore and superstition in shaping their understanding of time. While city dwellers might rely on clocks and schedules, rural communities often looked to nature for guidance. The blooming of certain flowers, the migration of birds, the phases of the moon, all of these served as markers of time and influenced their daily routines. It's a far cry from setting your iPhone alarm, isn't it? And, of course, religion played a significant role. Just as in the city, morning prayers were a common practice, a way of giving thanks for the new day and seeking guidance for the tasks ahead. But in the countryside, these prayers were often said outdoors, surrounded by the beauty and tranquility of nature. It's a different kind of church, isn't it? A church with real birds, and significantly more manure. So, as you stand there, breathing in the fresh country air, listening to the sounds of the farm awakening, you can't help but feel a sense of connection to the past. You're experiencing a way of life that was deeply rooted in the natural world, a world where time was measured not by clocks, but by the rhythms of nature. It's a different kind of alarm clock, isn't it? A rooster, a cow, and a whole lot of hard work. But somehow it feels right. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit more peaceful than that buzzing contraption on your nightstand. Just try not to think too much about the rooster stew. And now, as the hopefully fictional sun outside your window begins to dip below the horizon, and your eyelids feel heavier than a Victorian gentleman's pocket watch, let's just let go. You're lying there, back in your own bed, but the echoes of a Victorian morning still linger. You can almost smell the faint scent of coal smoke, even though your central heating is probably humming along quite nicely. Thank you very much. The gentle rhythm of the knockerupper's pole, now just a distant memory, fades into the background noise of your own life. Remember that simple breakfast? Perhaps, tomorrow, you might swap out your usual avocado toast, guilty, for a bit of porridge. Okay, maybe not. But the idea of a simple, nourishing start to the day, it's something to consider, isn't it? Think about the layers of clothing those Victorians donned. All those petticoats and waistcoats. You're probably in your pajamas, or, whatever you find comfortable, no judgment here. But there was a certain intentionality to getting dressed back then. A putting on of a persona, of readiness for the world. Maybe that's something we've lost a little in our age of athleisure wear. Then again, maybe not. Comfort is king, after all. Or queen. Or, you get the idea. You feel the softness of your own sheets against your skin, a far cry from the sometimes scratchy linens of the Victorian era. Though, let's be honest, some of those Victorian textiles were incredibly luxurious. Think silks and velvets. Historians still debate the degree to which the average Victorian actually experienced this luxury, of course. Was it widely available, or primarily the domain of the upper classes? The jury's still out. The weight of the day begins to lift. The demands of your own work, the endless emails, the social media scrolling, it all seems a little less urgent now. You've stepped outside of your own time, just for a little while, and glimpsed a different way of being. A slower way. A simpler way. And even though you wouldn't trade your smartphone for a sundial, would you? There's something appealing about the rhythms of that bygone era. The way the sun dictated the day. The way the community relied on each other. The way even the poorest person could, in theory, tell the time with a carefully placed candle. Did you know that some historians believe that the Victorian obsession with punctuality actually contributed to the rise of anxiety disorders? All that pressure to be on time, all the emphasis on schedules and deadlines. It's enough to make you want to throw your alarm clock out the window. Please don't actually do that. Remember the sounds of the city awakening? The clip-clop of horses' hooves, the cries of street vendors, the distant rumble of industry? Now, listen to the sounds around you. Maybe it's the hum of your refrigerator, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves outside your window, the distant siren of an ambulance. Our world is different, louder, faster. But it has its own beauty, too. You picture the knocker-upper, still making his rounds in your mind's eye. He's a peculiar figure, isn't he? A man whose livelihood depended on interrupting people's sleep. It's like being paid to be annoying. Although, in a way, isn't that what alarm clocks do? They're just a slightly less personal form of annoyance. And speaking of personal, think about the Victorian morning prayers. Whether you're religious or not, there's something to be said for starting the day with a moment of reflection. A moment to set your intentions, to express gratitude, to connect with something larger than yourself. Maybe that's a practice you could incorporate into your own routine. Or maybe not. No pressure. As you drift further into relaxation, recall the image of that candle clock, slowly melting away, marking the passage of time. It's a reminder that time is fleeting, that each moment is precious, and that even the simplest things can be imbued with meaning. There's a funny fringe theory that Victorian candle clocks were sometimes used to trigger elaborate Rube Goldberg machines. Imagine waking up to a series of cascading dominoes, a miniature cannon firing a confetti bomb, and a robotic arm gently placing a cup of tea on your bedside table. Okay, that's probably not true. But wouldn't that be amazing? Think about the women, especially, and the sheer work involved in getting ready for the day. The corsets, the bustles, the endless layers of fabric. It's enough to make you appreciate the simplicity of a t-shirt and jeans. And let's not forget the elaborate hairstyles. Some Victorian women spent hours each morning just getting their hair just so. You might even say they were hair-raisingly dedicated. Your breath slows. Your muscles relax. The world outside fades away. You're cocooned in your own little world, safe and warm and comfortable. The Victorian era was a time of great change, of innovation, of progress. But it was also a time of hardship, of inequality, of social upheaval. It's important to remember both the good and the bad, to learn from the past so that we can build a better future. And now, as you drift off to sleep, let's leave the Victorians to their own devices. Let's let them wake up to the sound of the knocker-upper, light their fires, and say their morning prayers. You, on the other hand, can simply close your eyes and drift off to sleep, knowing that you've learned a little something about the past and that you're ready to face whatever the future may hold. Sweet dreams. And don't let the bed bugs bite. They probably won't. Modern mattresses are much better than Victorian ones. Unless you bought a Victorian mattress. Then, good luck. And so, as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky with hues of rose and gold, the Victorian day was truly underway. The air, now thick with the sounds of industry and life, carried the scent of coal smoke and freshly baked bread, a symphony of the everyday. But let us now gently turn away from the bustling streets and the busy households, allowing those images to soften and fade, like watercolors left to dry in the sun. Imagine instead the quiet fields beyond the city limits, where dew still clings to the grass, and the only sound is the gentle murmur of the wind. The Victorian era, with its unique rhythms and routines, may seem like a distant dream now, a world both familiar and strange. But perhaps, as you drift off to sleep, you can carry with you the echo of a simpler time, a time when the rising sun was the only alarm needed, and the day unfolded at a more measured pace. Allow yourself to sink deeper now, letting go of the day's worries and anxieties. Picture that peaceful countryside scene, the soft light filtering through the trees, the gentle breeze whispering secrets through the leaves. Let these calming images wash over you, lulling you into a state of deep relaxation. Feel your body becoming heavy, your mind becoming still, and as you journey into slumber, remember the quiet grace of a Victorian morning, the simple pleasures of a life lived in harmony with nature's rhythms. May your dreams be filled with peace and tranquility, and may you awaken refreshed and renewed, ready to embrace the dawn.